Okay, hello everybody. I am Michael Adams, President of Philadelphia Watercolor Society. I want to welcome you today, and Tim Saternow, who's going to be talking about his upcoming workshop in October, and want to talk a little bit about what Tim does. Tim's a very famous American artist, member of American Watercolor Society, National Watercolor Society, among others. With Philadelphia Watercolor Society, he's won first place in other awards. So I think a lot of you are really familiar with Tim's excellent work. We were just talking about a piece he did 2 years ago in the Westchester show where he was the only painter in that exhibit that showed his work without glass. So it's something he'll like talk about a little bit. Tim has a really interesting background. He's art school graduate. He received his MFA from Yale University. He is a very successful fine artist represented in galleries in New York and in Providence, Massachusetts. And I think he makes a living as a lighting designer in theater and in movies. And you can tell by his work he uses the drama of light and really has a good understanding from his experience from his work. He's been nominated for a Emmy. He teaches classes every year at the Art Student League in New York, and we're all looking forward to his workshop in October. And you can take it over from here, Tim. Oh, one second. I just want to mention to everybody, if you have some questions that you'd like me to ask Tim, please put them in the chat room, and when I can, I will ask Tim about that. And everybody, if you could please mute your microphones during this whole presentation, and we'll get to everything as best we can. And I want to welcome you, Tim. Thank you very much for being here today.
Michael, thank you so much. I had to sort of laugh at sort of famous watercolors. Ask someone who's a famous painter and they'll go, Andy Warhol. But thank you for that sweet introduction. Thank you so much. And Lana is in the audience. I got to wave to Lana. She's a friend. Okay, we only have an hour and a half, so it's going to be fast, I'm afraid. So let me just start, and we're going to just look down at my table. I usually paint up on an easel. For the demos, it's much easier to do down here on my table. People kind of say, how can you paint up on an easel? And I say, it's the only way my back will survive painting all day. I can't bend over a table anymore. So painting up on an easel is how I do it. And the runs and sort of things sort of happen with it. This is a photograph that I'll be working from, and it's a townhouse here in Jersey City. I live in Jersey City, which is across the river from Manhattan. I'm what would be known as a, is this a word? I'm a valueist. It's funny, people sometimes call themselves colorists, but I'm a valueist. I approach my paintings first with value, lights and darks, sunlight and shadow. And I think that is from my background as a designer in the theater and film, where everything is about light. So the sketches I was doing for the movies and theater, it's all light-based. The film work that I did happened to be a little bit tighter, so that's sort of my drawing ability is a bit tight. So I'll start with a photograph like this, and I will then take all the color out of it and just make a black and white, just to sort of see the shapes of the light and the dark. And then what I do is I take the drawing and then I put a piece of trace paper on top of it. And once again, this is what I'll go over in my workshop. We'll start with a value sketch. And it's a real simplified breakdown of your research into light and dark. Get rid of the detail, just the light and the dark. And I do this because looking at a value sketch like this will tell me if the final painting is going to be interesting. If I know it works at this level in terms of light and dark, and there's a great dramatic energy coming from it, um, then I know it'll work as a painting. So this is sort of my first pass at developing up the photograph. And I will keep this next to me as I paint to remind me that these shapes are what really attracted me to this, and not so much the detail. Although I have a lot of detail, right, in my paintings. So already gone ahead and I've drawn this out on 300-pound Arches paper. And I will start the painting with just um, Payne's Gray. I tend to paint, here's my little Payne's Gray plug here, Winsor Newton Payne's Gray. I like Winsor Newton because uh, it has a beautiful blue quality to it. Many of the other Payne's Grays tend to be very gray, equally sort of neutral gray, neutral tint, where this has a beautiful blue quality to it. And this is different. I'll start with painting the shadows first. So I'll go in and just paint shadows first. And I'll turn my painting just to sort of do this. I use flat brushes almost entirely, and that comes from my background in film design. And I love these things because, look, I can get a beautiful straight line with this 1 inch or 3/4 inch flat brush. And this comes right in. And what the sort of the process is you're going to start with the darkest darks. Start with what is absolutely in shadow and the darkest shadows. Um, the traditional way of watercolor is, of course, you start with the lightest lights. So traditional landscape watercolor, you would do the sky first, and then you would do sort of the next value, which is probably the mountains, and you put in the mountains, and they're a little bit darker than the sky, but they're still very faint. And then you put in, I don't know, closer hills, and then trees. And each step that you do, you get darker. And that's sort of the traditional watercolor method of building up value. And I got to tell you, that works. That's a great way to paint. In my experience, I have found that I don't get dark enough. And as I was starting out painting, I would always get very frustrated that I wasn't getting the darks in it. Everything seemed a little bit too pale. So I kind of developed this way of starting with darks and then going to the light. This a little bit, that's also true with my with my theater design background, where I would draw the lighting in first, paint the lighting in first, and then add the color, because the lighting, of course, is the most important thing. I'll sort of move this over a little bit so you can see my research as I'm sort of doing this, and I'm just going to turn this with this. Let me do the building on the side, and I'm going to take this and turn it around this way. And what's lovely about this is, and I'm doing this side building here, there's a beautiful graded wash that goes right up the side of this building. So let me show you how I'm going to do that. I am going to wet the paper first. Of course, the magic of watercolor, you put the water where you want the paint to go. Right. And then I'll just do a little bit of a graded wash right up the side. So I'm trying to duplicate what this shadow is doing on this building next door.
So Tim, do you have a routine that you like to keep as or when you're starting a painting? Do you like work certain hours? Do you have background music? What are you comfortable with when you're doing a painting?
Uh, it's funny. I've done a lot of opera design, and I tend to listen to opera when I'm painting. I if I can't listen to stuff with words because I begin to sing along and it sort of distracts me. So the opera stuff is good um, because you can't understand what they're saying. I paint. It's funny. Over COVID, I was painting at home, and I was painting all hours of the day and night. And I love that fact. I gave up my studio at that time and started painting at home. And I it was an amazing freedom that I could just go into my studio here and paint whenever I wanted. Um, so I don't know if that answers your question, but that's sort of the little bit of the process that yeah, this is nice. A little bit of a graded wash here, right up the side of this building. I'll come back to that. Let me just do the sort of top here. I'm just going to break up this cornice, and there is the shadows that run right along the cornice. And once again, using this big flat brush can give me a beautiful straight line.
Now, do you ever ride your brush along a ruler?
No, I've tried that. The paint runs under the ruler. I end up making a mess of that. No, I find that I can actually do very straight lines up on an easel where I lift the painting up relatively high and I just drag my hand. And the secret is I'm pushing on this pad. So
Right.
this is what's controlling my brush here, right? This is not a great way to paint lines, but this way is a great way to paint lines. So you sort of drag your hand right across.
And it has more of a hand painted feel where it can get really mechanical if you're too precise.
We were talking about that earlier. Yeah. You know, that whole splash sort of thing that I do was a way to break up such a tight painting. Because I'll start out, as you can see, this is going to be a rather tight painting. And I would sort of fight it. Excuse me, just a moment. I'm going to get a piece of paper. I don't usually paint on this table. And with all the humidity, my hand is sticking to the table. So let's see it. No, that's no good. Hold on. That's better. Okay. Now I can, this will slide better for me. Okay. If anyone has any questions, really just call them out. Michael will relay them to me about anything that I'm doing here that you have a question about. Because of time, I'm going to make some sort of bolder paint moves. There's a little bit more detail within this shadow, but I'm going to go ahead and just put the shadow in. I want to make sure I get through this demo. My paintings, it's funny. I don't know if you've had this experience, but people don't know how to ask artists questions, not non-painters. And I usually get this question when they're looking at my work. They go, "Oh, this is lovely. How long did it take you to paint it?" And I
Exactly.
go, "Oh, I don't know, 30 years, 40 years." Um, and I tend to paint 3 or 4 paintings at once. I don't know if it's my ADD, but I tend to get I get a little bored as I'm painting. So I'll have another painting all lined up that I can just move into.
Yeah, I think you get used to the tedium of painting. It's part of the discipline of painting. And you were talking about being distracted by listening to songs and people singing. And I like listening to audiobooks where somebody's reading to me. I can really like focus, and that helps me get through the tedium of a really busy piece.
I should try that. But then again, it's someone talking at me, and I'll probably talk back.
So you mentioned you've been painting for 30 years. What were you doing 30 years ago? And at what point did you really kind of get into the groove and feel comfortable with the subject matter that you're doing now? How long have you been doing that?
You know, I had a career in both theater and film. I was based in New York. Um, I did a bunch of shows on Broadway, which is crazy, but the money is very good on Broadway, and it was all very exciting. The film work is a little bit heartless, but it pays very, very well. What I began to experience was, gee, I love doing these sketches because as a designer, I would have to show the director and eventually the cast and everyone else working on the production exactly what the design that I was working on was going to look like. So I would need to do these um, very detailed uh, drawings, sketching. In theater, they call them renderings. That's an architectural term. Um, and I developed on my painting then. So I was always painting in watercolor. It's kind of the medium, it's fast, and you can get beautiful light effects with watercolor. Um, I was teaching. I've taught across the country. A friend of mine took me to my first watercolor class when I was in my 30s. Even though I had been painting watercolor for years, I never took a class. And I took this wonderful class in Pittsburgh with an artist named Bill Versek. Bill's a member of the American Watercolor Society and a wonderful teacher. And I I started to learn actually how to really paint instead of the fakey stuff that I was doing as a theater designer. I say fakey stuff. It isn't really fake. I would use anything and everything as I was developing a design. I would use pastel and spray paint and acrylic and whatever would work in terms of to get my design across. And of course, Bill taught, pure watercolor. He paints in Pittsburgh, and he paints these beautiful urban scenes in Pittsburgh. Yeah, it's a little down and dirty here. Um, and then I just started painting for myself, not the theater work, not the film work, but just having an opportunity uh, to be able to paint. And I just, as you guys have experienced, you fall in love with it. And I think I fell in love with it because it was so difficult. It was so difficult to paint pure watercolor. For my theater work, I would be, using all kinds of different materials to get the effect. Where in watercolor, I sort of had to discover how to do that with just watercolor. That was in the 90s. And eventually I left teaching and decided to just paint full time, which was crazy. Everyone thought I was crazy. Everyone thought I was crazy, and they were envious of me. I was teaching up in Connecticut at that time, up at UConn. And yeah, I kind of dove into it. And people ask, how did you get started? I applied to everything, every contest that was available. Back then, they had a number of watercolor magazines, and I just sent stuff out just to see what would come back. Oh, I also went back to school. I went to the Art Students League, and I studied with a brilliant artist named Paul Ching-Bor. And Paul was a revelation to me, because he would put the paintings up on the wall and just throw watercolor at it. He would use a foot-wide hockey brush, which are those very short, bristled Chinese brushes. And he would finish his painting, and then he would do layer upon layer upon layer of watercolor on top of it.
So I have a question for you.
Yes.
Linda Bassade asks, I'm looking at some of your paintings, Tim. I noticed that you have both loose areas and then very fine detail. In one of your city scenes, I noticed you added specific wrought iron details on one of the buildings, terraces, and lettering on the trucks, and other areas were much softer and nondescript. How do you decide where to stay loose and where to add detail?
Wow, good question. I think if I had a theory of painting, I would say, or what paintings I like the best, I like paintings that are a little bit mysterious, that do not answer all the questions that you would see in something like a photograph. And as I would deconstruct the paintings, and I'm going to show you that today, different parts of the painting would be covered in paint or water and would bleed, and other parts of the painting would not have done that. And it's a little bit serendipitous. It's sort of whatever it sort of comes out to look like. And I kind of like that play between tight realism, I guess I can say that, and mystery, sort of easier, more softer areas that are not as cleanly done. And when I get to the splash part, it is just, it's so much fun to be able to take what you very carefully have painted and then throw stuff at it to break it up. I would look at my paintings and I would get kind of like, oh my goodness, this is much too tight. So throwing the water and the other paint on it would help to break it up. I don't know. Did I answer that question? Michael, did I answer that question?
Yes, yeah, for the most part, I think. I think, just with your background as a lighting designer, the way you use text and decide what's important in a painting really is obvious by where you're focusing some of the lettering and the color throughout the whole painting. So you have that soft atmospheric, mysterious areas of darkness and light combined with the really super detailed line work and lettering. So I think your background really shows in how you create drama in your work with your choices.
There is a truism in art direction for film, and this is true in theater also, but the graphics in a film will tell everybody what year it is. There is nothing stronger than looking at the lettering on a store or an advertisement, and it kind of locks in immediately to what year it is. And as a designer, you would sort of study the different periods of lettering style, to be able to know that to use this certain font would lock it into a certain period.
Right.
And I love doing that. As a scenic artist, when I was painting scenery, lettering was like my thing. I love to get the beautiful angled brushes, the chisel brushes, because those would, if anyone has done calligraphy, you know what I'm talking about. That would get the cut so beautifully into the lettering styles. Michael and I were talking about, Michael has painted a number of murals. When I was painting in the theater, you know, the backdrops we would paint would be, you know, 60 feet by 40 feet. And to paint something that large is just, it's thrilling. It's absolutely thrilling. But there you would do, of course, there would be a crew of painters, 10 or 12 painters on something that large. And that's fun. I mean, to paint that large is just thrilling.
I have another question from Jane Wise. She asks, do you pull shapes out of those dark shadows sometime?
Oh, yes. Yeah, you know, this initial sketch that I did is ignoring detail. But as I'm doing the painting, of course, I'm putting in detail. And that detail is either I'll paint around things, as I'm doing now with this window, or different parts will be lighter and darker within the shadow space. As you notice, I'm not putting the tree in. Part of it is for time today. But in this piece of research, I don't find the tree helping me very much in terms of the composition.
But if you were painting a tree, would you use Misket?
No, I never use that. No, I'm lying. I will use tape, especially if there's something like a headlight that I don't want my splatter to disappear. I'll put a piece of tape over it and I'll cut it to the shape. Maskoid, or the plastic, the latex masking fluids, I haven't found one that really works well. I think the best is the Winsor Newton brand. You know, it's funny, when I've used it, I always have to go back in and soften all the edges of what I've masked, because of course it'll look like a mask, that I did use a mask. And yet some painters that I've seen at the American Watercolor Society, you know, will use the masks extensively, and that of course becomes part of the rhythm of the painting. Who does that? Judy Betts. Judy Betts does beautiful paintings where she outlines everything in mask. It looks like almost batik, if anyone knows how to batik a cloth. And I'm looking at my time here. So I'm avoiding some detail just in terms of time today. And as you can see, I've drawn in the shadow lines. So that's telling me where to put my shadows. And I invite you, if you don't use big brushes, I invite you to use big brushes. It's another freeing thing that I love.
It's cool to see your technique with the flat brushes. Like I don't work in flat brushes all that often, but I see you have, you know, kind of a pull technique, and then you have a dabbing technique
Yep.
that works really well.
I do use round brushes, of course, and I'm amazed at the folks who only use round brushes. Since a lot of my work is architectural, I just find that the flat brushes work just beautifully to cut in to different parts of the painting. So for something like this, I'm putting down a color, and then I'm putting some water next to it to sort of soften it and to pull it down the page like this to get a little bit of a graded wash on that window. I'm constantly turning and twisting this to make sure that I've gotten everything on here. This bottom part just sort of fades into the shrubbery in front here. So I'll come back and do the shrubbery. I'll do the shrubbery with a round brush, yeah.
So you're already getting a really nice feeling of light in the piece. Really great contrast. So you
Thank you.
mentioned earlier a lot of watercolors tend to work from light to dark, and I like Payne's gray too because the stability of Payne's gray is really great because you can wash and tint over it where some underpainting or shadow painting what I call it. It
Underpainting, yes,
it's very soluble and can cause problems, but the Payne's gray is really great as underpainting to establish light and form.
exactly. What Payne's gray has a little bit of a staining quality to it. And as I work on this and throw water on it, you'll see that it picks up what I've painted. But it doesn't obliterate what I've painted. There's enough of the staining quality that this initial layer of shadow will always be there. I love the shadow going down the stairways.
When I was reading your bibliography on your website, I found a really interesting burning question by Anne Heavener, and I don't know if it was for a book or for a magazine, but she asked, what did you know now that you wish you'd known when you were first getting started as an artist?
Anne is such a good friend. I've written a couple articles for Watercolor magazine. I finally met her. She was a guest speaker last year at the dinner, the AWS dinner. And we've been in contact for 10 years or so. And she asked those questions. It's a recurring column in the Watercolor magazine. And Michael, I'm going to ask you to ask me that again.
Okay. So she asked, what do you know now that you wish you knew when you were first getting started as an artist?
Oh, to relax. When you begin, everything is precious. And only until you're able to let go does the art really begin. I have a friend who's a concert pianist, and he practices his hours over hours and over hours. And he says, I need to get it into my fingers. And it's the same way. You need to get a confidence in a technique that you're looking at the painting as a painting and not worrying about how you're putting the paint down. My biggest change came when I started painting every day. When I was still teaching and working in the theater, I would paint, in the summer when I go on vacation. But when I made the decision to become a full-time painter, it was, you're going to paint every day. And there's nothing there's nothing to substitute for that type of experience. Okay, so now you're beginning to see some wonderful shadow, some wonderful sort of light and shadow that's happening here. This window is bad. And as this dries, I will begin then to go back into it and put in some shadow next to some of the other parts of this.
Was it an adjustment to paint on 300-pound cold press and compared to 140-pound cold press?
Oh yes, 300-pound doesn't wrinkle. It's fabulous.
Don't you feel you have to kind of work in the watercolor a little bit more on 300-pound watercolor, push it into the surface a little bit more?
Yeah, I think you're right. You need to be. It has a different sizing. You know, not only is the paper thicker, there's a sizing difference between the paintings, between the papers, and but because I put wax on top of my paintings, I needed to have a stronger paint surface, and the 300-pound is sort of the best in terms of framing it how I frame my paintings without plexiglass. Okay, it's coming slowly. And once again, I'll go back to my value sketch. And this just reminds me, it's like, is the power of that sketch coming through in the painting? And I'm liking this. This is fun, what I'm seeing here. Okay, anything else I'm missing? Of course, I'm missing a lot here, but I'm going to just move along because this is pretty good. I'm going to do a little bit of the shrubbery here. And this is where I like to use my sponges. And I don't know if everyone uses sponges or has used them. The secret to using a sponge is you get it nice and wet first. And as you can see, the shadows here are all broken up and the sponge is sort of perfect. The secret of using a sponge is when you put it down, you want to turn it. So you're constantly moving the sponge in different directions. If you don't do that, then it looks like a repeat, that you're simply repeating the same shape over and over again. And this is I'm just going to begin to put in just some of this shadow. Just to break it up. I saw a tree service truck, a company that does works on trees, and the front of the truck had oh, who did it? Happy Trees. Who was he?
Bob Ross.
Bob Ross. Thank you so much. It had a picture of Bob Ross, and the the saying for the company was "Happy Trees." Sorry, I have a weird sense of humor here.
Ask the question.
Yes.
I have a Bob Ross bobblehead on my desk. Is a meme for me.
He was inspiring. You may not like his work, but boy, did he got everyone painting.
Exactly.
One of those snobby art magazines, Art in America or something, did a obituary of Bob. And they basically said, yeah, you may not like his work, but boy, did he get people painting.
It's too bad he signed some poor contracts. He really got ripped off. People actually bought his identity pretty much, and he didn't do as well as he could have,
Yeah.
I think. So earlier on, Tim, we were talking before this all started about your painting that was in the Westchester Philadelphia Watercolor Society show 2 years ago,
Yes.
how it was unframed and you had wax it. Talk a little bit about that. It's really a new thing in watercolor, and what got you into that, and what's involved with doing that?
Um, that's an interesting question. I began showing my work both here in New York and in different galleries. And it was such a pain to mat it and put it behind plexiglass or glass. And I began to sort of search out other ways of presenting watercolor. And at one of those dinners at the AWS, I sat next to a conservator, and I began to ask him, what could I use that would be archival and protect a painting. Now, there's a lot of plastic, acrylic mats out there, matte and gloss acrylic. I'm forgetting
Sprays.
Yeah, sprays and yeah, which you can cover your painting. What bothered me about that is it's a water-based, and if you put the water-based sealant on top of this, it's going to pick up the watercolor. And I found that it smeared it all over the place, and it was like, well, that's not working. I need to find something else. Someone had mentioned to me something called cold wax medium, and I will just pull out my cold wax medium here. This is Dorland's cold wax medium. Dorland's makes this, and so does Gamblin. Cold wax medium is usually used in oil paints. See how thick it is? It's used in oil paints. You mix it in oil paint so you can get more impasto, thicker paint. And I don't know how I don't know how I did. I just put it, I started to put it on the paper. And I noticed that when I put the wax on the paper, none of the paint would move because it has a slight petroleum basics to it. And I just started covering it with the wax. And I remember I had a show in New York and everything else was in frame, but we needed an extra painting. So I brought a painting in that was not behind plexiglass, and I had waxed it, and the gallery kind of loved it because it was such a contemporary look for that. What I didn't know is that the wax will migrate entirely through the paper. And 6 months later, I got a call, the gallery got a call from Seattle where the painting ended up. The painting had actually fallen off the mount because the wax permeated through the paper and nothing sticks to wax. So they had to send it out to be repaired. So what I do now is I cover the back of the painting first in acrylic, and that becomes the separation between my adhesive material, whatever I'm using on the back, and the wax itself. Okay, I'm in pretty good shape here. I haven't done a lot of the other detail. I'm going to quickly show you what I love to do. And if you notice, there are these wonderful power lines running through the painting. I'm going to do my power line demonstration. And what I use is what's known as a rigger brush. This is a rigger. And of course, it's called a rigger because it was developed in the 18th and 19th century to paint the rigging on ships, on those beautiful English paintings of the warships. So what it is, it's a very long brush that holds a lot of paint, but it's very thin. And I'm going to try to, this takes a little bit of nerve because you only get one chance. So I am just going to drag this across and create And once again, I am dragging my hand. Doesn't have to be fast, but it has to be steady. There we go. That's number one. Let's do number two. I ran out of juice. Start again. There we go. That's good. With this, if you slow down, more paint will be transferred onto the paper. So this is a big fat. So I'm pressing down a little bit harder. Make a bit of a thicker line. And here I'll bring this in so you guys can see. I don't know if you can see the wiring for this. There's one that goes up this way. And there's one that cuts across the top. This is an expensive brush. This is a brush made by a company called Rosemary, a British company. I love it because it's a company developed by a woman who had gone through a divorce. This is outside of London. And she created a company of all women making brushes. And they're beautiful brushes. I'm going to go over this one a little bit more. It's a bit thicker.
I think I'm holding my breath while you're doing that, your line work there. It's very, very nerve-wracking,
There you go.
very brave. So do you find you do better work with a better quality brush, a more expensive brush?
This is my theory of material. Spend money on paper, spend money on professional paints, and have a couple good brushes. A lot of my brushes are very cheap, and I use these fabulous brushes that I get. You get them by the dozen. And I'll show you as I begin to put in color. These are just the cheapest craft brushes, and they give great texture. Let's see if I've done all of this. Let me look at this. Oh, there's this over here. You know, my parents, when I went away to college way back when, they bought me a Winsor Newton Series 7 brush, and I never used it. I was too afraid to use it. It was too expensive. A number 8 Series 7 at that time was about 90 bucks. And I was, I still have it, and I don't use it. But yes, once you use good brushes, and of course, if you want to do something like this where I cut in beautifully, just putting in this window, you want a good brush. You know, a good brush will give you a good edge. And as you can see, if I hold these brushes sideways, you can see the beautiful, beautiful line that this brush makes.
Very sharp. What's the make of those brushes?
Believe it or not, these are called Dynasty.
Dynasty.
I use something called Dynasty brushes, and I buy them by the dozen. They're not expensive, but they're very, very good. So both my flats and my rounds are Dynasty, but I have a whole bunch of the other ones, the Winsor Newton brushes and those other ones. Okay, I have done most of this, and now I get to do my splashing. So I studied, as I told you, with Paul Ching-Boer, and he would put his paintings up on the wall and throw water. I'm going to pull out my camera just a little bit to get a little bit more of this. Here we go. But it was running too much for me. It would run down. So I put my paintings on the ground, and I just, here now, I'm using something called a chip brush. These are really cheap. These are cheap brushes you get in the hardware store. Look at this old one. These are for like putting glue. Carpenters put glue on stuff and they use these brushes. What's great about them is they don't hold water very well. So the first thing I'll do is I'll just spatter water just on top of it. And as I spatter, I look at two things. I'm trying to break the line between light and dark. Make sure I go off the edge of the page. And then just wait a few minutes and see what the paint does. And in some places it will run. In other places, it doesn't. I didn't put enough paint down there. So the next thing I'll do is I'll take the same brush and I'll make a very pale Payne's gray, and I'll go right over everything that I just did. As you can imagine, my studio has a lot of paint spattered on it. And now it's sort of, what I love about this is it takes the, what I call the curse. It takes the curse off of the straight lines and the perfection for my art direction days. And for me, this is so much more interesting on this. Now, if we go back to my original, you'll see that there's some beautiful warm colors. So what I do while this is still wet, I'm going to use burnt umber. I have all my paints, by the way, in these dishes, these Corel dishes. And I'll make a little bit of a very pale burnt umber. And then for this, I will put this sort of right into the blue. Michael said earlier, does this scare you? I got to tell you, this is the most fun.
Yeah, that's super scary for most of us. It has kind of like a nostalgic quality to it, something that like an old print or something. It has like kind of that feel that's kind of cool.
People have said that, like an old photograph. Sure, I love that. Why not? I love putting the warm into the dark, into the cool blues. So you can see, I don't know if you can see it on the film, but there's some beautiful burnt sienna in this dark blue. It'll become more apparent as it dries. And I love that interchange of warm and cool. So at this point, I have to let it dry now. So what I have here, and this is the other thing that I can't live without. This is a heat gun. Blick sells them for about $16. And what I love about it is it's absolutely quiet. Now, what I usually do is I'll splash and then I'll come in the next morning. I'll let it dry overnight. And I love being surprised the next day. And this is going to take a few minutes. So I think we can open up and take questions. This is going to take about 5 minutes or so to really dry. Does anyone have any questions of something that I've done that wasn't clear?
If you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, feel free. As you've noticed in the chat box, there's information about Tim's workshop, October 15th and 16th at Penn State Great Valley this fall, and he's going to be going into detail. It's going to be a 2-day workshop. You'll be able to paint with Tim, so check that out if you're interested.
Right. And Michael, you've been reading these, I assume, to me, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Somebody asked, remind me of the blue you used to splatter. Is that the Payne's gray?
Yep, that's the Payne's gray once again.
Okay.
Winsor Newton Payne's Gray. So I use the base color to do the first splash. And then the second splash, I will try to find a color that is already in my research. And in this case, the burnt umber is sort of perfect brick color. But here's a caveat. You can use anything you want to splash. Any series of color, any combination of color.
So this is a really fascinating process, totally different than what I would have guessed you would have done this. For some reason, I thought you did a finished painting and then you put blotches of color on it later, and because of what the watercolor was soluble, that it would bleed into and create these things. So you're kind of doing it midway in the painting. It's just kind of unexpected to see that you really haven't gotten into your color tinting and washes at all in the painting. That your your blacks and underpainting and shadow color, whatever, are in the first part, and then this is your like second steps. Really interesting.
Yeah, I love if the Payne's Gray has still a little bit of moisture in it, the splashing will really pick it up and move it.
Do you draw with a mechanical pencil generally?
No, number four,
Uh-huh.
number four, regular Ticonderoga pencil, simple. I had a lot of drafting experience, of course, when I was a designer. So I have all these fabulous drafting tools. But no, on many of these, I will establish my vanishing points and draw from that. Classic sort of perspective drawing.
Yeah.
This particular painting I would call one of my city portraits. It's really just an elevation of a building. An elevation is a theater term where you show a part of the set and it's just to give to the carpenters. So you just give a flat-on view of what you want the carpenters to build. That's called an elevation. So this painting here, there's not much perspective to it.
Yeah, some of your paintings or drawings rather really have acute perspective, 2-point perspective and everything. Do you
Yeah.
establish your vanishing point on your horizon line for a big piece as reference for your angles as you're drawing it out?
You know, if you look at my paintings, you will see that there is actually a hole in my paintings because I take a pin, I take a T-pin, I stick it right through the paper, and that becomes my vanishing point. Because then I can line up my straight edge and 233. We're done at 3, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, look I'm going to do something kind of weird because this is not drying as much as I thought. It's very humid here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up my painting and I'm just going to see what happens. Oh, fabulous. I need to get a lot of the water off of this. What a mess. Now, this is something I usually do later on in the process. This splashing, I will do 3 or 4 times on a painting. But it's so humid here, nothing's drying. So this will speed up the process. So look at it now. It's like, oh, how cool is that? I've lost a little bit of the blooms and stuff, but as it dries, you'll be able to see the runniness of this. It makes the house look older. Yeah, it does. Absolutely. And it is a great old house, right?
Yeah.
Now, this is, I think, particularly good with my New York paintings because New York is kind of dirty. New York is kind of smoggy, dusty, dirty. But here, as you can begin to see, there's pieces that are falling away because of the spatter and the shadow. And I love that. Some things in bright sunlight, others in shadow. Well, this is a quick demo, people. Okay, it is getting dry enough. I'm just gonna go for broke. Parts of it are still wet, but I want to show you the next fun part. Now, since all my shadow is already here, all I need to do is simply indicate, so I simply need to just paint the color right over this. I'm going to pull in my research next to me so you can see this. And there's this beautiful sort of reddish band of bricks that runs along the top. And I'm just going to go in and put in it's a little more orange, so maybe I'll use a little bit more of the burnt sienna. And here, as you can see, I'm mixing two colors within this. And I'm just painting right over all of that mess. And here I'm doing a mix of two colors.
Yeah, that splatter really makes the house look older, like you said. It really gives it a really interesting look.
There's a beautiful copper cornice on this. And of course, it's all, ooh, that's a little strong. Got to be careful with your greens. There we go. So I'm just going to wash a little bit of this blue-green on top of the cornice.
So Jane Wise asked, do you use the blotches mainly for texture or mainly to loosen up the edges and soften the hard, tight lines?
My answer is yes. Both of those. Both of those. You know, if you look at the painting as a journey, instead of you have your research and you're going to make it look like the research, the painting should speak to you in terms of what it needs. And there comes a time where you want to just take that research photograph and put it aside and just look at what the painting is telling you to do. It's a little bit greener than I thought. Let's add a little bit of blue to that. I'll let that dry.
So if you Tim, if you have an area where things go wrong, say you're doing a line and your cat jumps on the table and it screws up your nice controlled line, or you have a color you don't like in the painting, what do you do to repaint something in your own work? Do you work opaque, or do you try to wash it out, or how do you handle a situation like that in your work?
I laugh because I just saw an exhibit of Andrew Wyatt's watercolors up in Maine. And he must have left it on the floor because there's dog tracks over some of his exquisite watercolors, right?
Yeah.
You know, with this technique, the mistakes can be repairable, right? It really, you're really not locked into perfection. You know, I do use tricks like everyone knows Mr. Clean. What are they called? Magic eraser.
That's one of the best inventions.
Right. You got to be very careful with that. It ruins the surface of the paper. So you have to know that when you put it down, it's going to disrupt whatever color you're going to put on top of it. And here I'm going in, I'm just putting a little bit of this brick color in. This is a Naples yellow, Naples yellow. It's not exactly the color I'm looking for, but this is going to be the first layer.
It's interesting that you bring up Andrew Wyeth. That was something that I saw. There was a show at the Brandywine maybe about 10 years ago on a painting he did called Ides of March,
Yeah.
and a painting of this dog sleeping in front of a fireplace. And they had 40 sketches and studies he did for this particular painting. And they had his studio set up when he painted it. And here he was throwing his sketches and pencils and stuff on the ground, walking on them, spilling coffee on them. The dog sitting there, very kind of slobby, and really made me feel good to see that part of Andrew White, that he didn't really care about that part. He's really focused on the final work, and wasn't afraid to get a little bit dirty.
You know, he would say that he would use the watercolor as kind of a quick sketch to kind of capture something. And that of course, his tempera paintings were so developed and took quite a long time. I hope I'm not upsetting anyone. I find Andrew Wyeth's watercolor to be so much more passionate, I think, if that's a good word to use, than his tempera paintings. It's a whole different way of thinking, where watercolor, you can get it down quickly, and tempera, of course, takes a while. Here I am painting this yellow brick right into my shadow. And this is what I love about this technique. The shadow is already there. I'm just introducing a color on top of it. Now, I do know that the Naples yellow is a very sediment color, which means its consistency is more opaque, a little more opaque than transparent watercolors. It tends to sit on top. Very good. I'm not liking that cornice color at all. Let me go back in. I'm looking at my time. Yeah, this is better. And I love the fact that with watercolor, you can just layer and layer and layer.
Yeah.
As Michael said earlier, you know, the underpainting, this is old Renaissance painting technique. That's a little bit better color. With the speed. And then this yellow is actually a little oranger, so I'm going to put a layer of the burnt sienna on top of that Naples yellow. That's nice. It pulls it back into a little bit more of the brick color. The headers on the windows, are more yellow, so I'm going to leave those. Yeah, putting this a little bit has shifted that brick color, taking away the curse of that yellow a little bit. There's a bit of brick here on the porch.
I love the transparent layering because you can see that great texture under one or two or three layers still
Okay.
coming through because of the transparency. So that's so nice.
I'm working a little bit faster than I usually. I'm looking at the time. This is a quick demo, people. Put a little bit of that Naples yellow right on top of that brick color. Trying to capture that strange brick. The doors are a darker brown, and I'm going to use a little bit of my Van Dyke brown for the doors. Oops. I painted brick when there should have been doors. That's okay. And at this point, I don't mind layering color and building up the color slowly. I may want to go back in, make this a little bit more richer. All right. We have brick in front. Wash in just a little bit of that burnt sienna. I like using these Corel dishes. They don't move.
I think using those little dishes, it reminds me of using a little Japanese watercolor porcelain bowls.
Yes.
You like it because I know some of your work is really quite large because you can immediately get really large puddles of water for painting. Is that why you prefer working
Yes.
in the individual bowls?
Yes, exactly. I'm going to use one of my wonderful cheap brushes here. Let's see
So
which
how
one.
many bowls do you have?
I'm sorry?
How many bowls do you have? How many colors do you have filled up?
Well, if you can, when we go back to me speaking, I'll show you my, what do they call it, tabaret next to me. I have a lot. There's a lot, and I buy them every time I see them. I can't find these bowls as much as one. So here's my sort of I mix up my own greens primarily. And I'll just go in and just sort of brush in. And this is what's great about this brush. I have a nice texture underneath with that sponge. And here, if I just dab in some of this color, I can get a little bit of the range of those greens that I'm seeing. Nice. Let's do a little bit of something on our front sidewalk here. Ooh, I didn't do my steps. Of course, each of these steps has that beautiful brick color on it also. So we'll introduce a little bit of that color. And then on top of that, put a little bit of that burnt sienna. Okay, it's getting close. It's not as strong as I want it to be. It's not as dark as I want it to be. At this point, I would actually go back in with my Payne's gray, and I would reestablish, and I'm just going to do a bit of this up here. I'd reestablish some of the shadows that have washed away, because I've noticed that my deep shadow on the top here has gotten too pale. And it's a real sort of back and forth as you're painting to sort of pull out the darks and then go back in and put in some more darks. And if I'm having trouble with a painting, I don't know, you know, when a painting clicks or it doesn't click, it probably means I don't have my darks dark enough. I'm loving this here. You get this wonderful sense of shadow here, and I'm not getting the darkness I really want up in this cornice. So it's all very wet, but I'll just sort of put in a little bit of that darkness. And just by putting back in the Payne's gray, I'm kind of reestablishing that sunlight, which is so beautiful. Right. This is very fast. I realize I'm running out of time here, but as you can see, it's kind of there. I can see on my screen that the color that I have in front of me, what's on the screen is much paler. So let's see if I lift it up, if you can. Yeah, the color's a little bit stronger, but there is the zoom thing. Now, what I'll do when all of this is dry is I'll go back to my fun chip brushes. These are called chip brushes. And I love cerulean blue. Cerulean blue is another one of those sediment paints. Sort of a thicker paint, a little bit more opaque. And what I'll do with that is I'll actually put the cerulean blue right on top of everything. And I find that a little bit of that color kind of does my sky. And it's a coolness on top of all of this warm brick that I find very exciting. And it's wonderful because it'll sit in those shadows.
That cerulean blue really, in the blotches of blue you put in there now, really add to the quality of light that's reflected in the windows now too. There's a nice relationship there.
Isn't that nice? Yes. Here, I didn't do my brick on the side there. That'll have to wait. So I use both cerulean blue and I also use back to my Naples yellow. And for some reason, they don't make green. You would think throwing these colors together. But see, I love that warm on top of all the darks. Now, once again, I will do, 3 or 4 different splashes as the painting's drying or dried. Here, everything is really running together, but there's an energy that I'm loving here by just breaking it up even a little bit more on top. There we go, something like that. Now, it's wet, and when it dries, it'll become a little bit less intense. But look at what's happening here in the shadow. I love that bleed of that light Naples yellow right into these shadows. And as it dries, that'll really fade away again. But since this is all transparent, I can go back in and beef up. Now, see, I'm very dissatisfied with this band of orange. And I should wait till it dries, but I want to show you guys before we leave. That's simply not strong enough for me. So I'm going to go back in, put in a little bit more color. I was attracted to this. This is a townhouse right around the corner from my house here. Yeah, that's better. Reestablish a little bit of that chroma. I don't think my cornice is the green that I really want, but I can go back into that a little bit later. And the brick is also very yellow. I probably want to go back in, do another, but I'd have to wait till all of this dries. And by going back and forth, putting in color, putting in shadow, and then spattering on top of it, you begin to get this wonderful sort of texture, depth, mystery going on in your painting. We are 5-3. I want to make sure that I can answer some questions before we stop. Michael, how's our time?
My watch ran out of my battery went dead on mine, so I don't even know what time is it.
We're 5-3.
2:56. Well, if you go over a couple minutes, that's fine. I just wanted to mention how important a really clean drawing is in your drawing here. It really isn't the structure of the whole painting, that even though you're painting very spontaneous and loosey-goosey with the splatter and everything, it holds together so well because your drawing was so good. And it
Yes,
still holds the whole thing together really well.
You know, and the underpainting, that first pass of Payne's gray kind of holds the structure of this painting underneath everything that's happening.
Right.
And I can see now as it's drying, stuff is sort of puddling, and I'm losing a lot of that energy. So I'll wait till it dries and I'll do more layers on top of it. This is a little bit fast. I usually don't work this wet,
Right.
but boy, there's some cool things going on here that I love. Once again, the shadow here is so wonderful and it's working. I need to put that shadow up into this cornice again, because the cornice for me is a bit too pale, as you can see from the research. I want to work on the windows a little bit more, and on the shrubbery in front. I'm missing a little bit of the depth in the shrubbery, which means I probably want to come back in with a little bit more of this Payne's gray, add a little bit more depth into that. And here I'm just using that cheap brush. It's very wet. It's running around like crazy here. No one has any questions? Did I answer everything correctly?
I think so. So interesting to see your technique, totally different than what I expected, and still frightens me personally. But I'd like to try to loosen up a little bit my own work. It really looks like like you're having a lot of fun when you're painting. I can tell as you're talking about it, that you are having some fun. So that's really great. So I think a lot of people take watercolor so seriously. I think every piece has to be perfect. Every piece has to be a masterpiece, and they're kind of losing something in the experience because they're so uptight about it.
You know, I think watercolor has a property unlike any other medium that gives me this freedom. And I've tried to paint this way with oils, and the viscosity of oil is completely different than water. The oil spreads out immediately. I don't get puddles. You know, I've tried doing this and splashing an oil painting with turpentine or whatever. Not only is it very poisonous, it's a completely different technique. I love these drips because they actually will stay where I throw them. This is also a quality of the paper. This Arches paper really holds the paint in place. Different paper will do different things. If you use Fabriano, I find Fabriano paper to be very soft, and things tend to run a little bit easier on a Fabriano paper. Right. Have I hit everything? Oh yeah. Oh, I wanted to show you what I will also do in the workshop. This is what I have everyone do, and it's just a color chart. And if you notice, I have removed some of the paint. And what this is telling me is the staining quality of the paints that I've chosen. You can look on the tube, it'll tell you, but this is the quick way to show you exactly how much staining power that has. And the other thing I do with my beginner classes is I'll do a color chart, color mixing chart, where each color is put down the side, and then I mix them. And what this tells me is the terrific range that I'll have in my, this is big. But I have this hanging up in my studio, and I can glance over at this and look at all the range of color by simply mixing two of the colors together. I forgot to show that at the beginning.
So Tim, are you going to continue working on this piece? And if so, is it possible you could send us a JPEG of that we could post so people could check it out later?
Yes, I would love to do that.
That'd be
Because
great.
this is not finished, and I want to get in there with some really bolder color and some bolder shadow. Once again, I'm loving what's happening here, and I'm missing it. You know, the side of this isn't dark enough, so lots going on here.
Oh, looks really, really great. I found it very inspirational. Tim, we want to thank you for your time and your shared techniques. It was really great.
Great. Thank you, everyone. This is wonderful. And look at my email is simply tim.saternow@gmail.com. If you have any questions, email me. You can go through that, or you can go through my website. Keep in touch.